One argument I have encountered is, well, if you want to know something about who is in charge in Venezuela, look at the allies, look at who is voting with Venezuela at the UN. Russia, Syria, Iran, Cuba, these are not democracies. How do you see that argument?
I think if you look at the UN votes on Venezuela, generally we see a pattern where the large majority of the world tends to support the government. I mean, an example would be right now that the United States is trying to lead a coalition to try to delegitimize the Venezuelan government of Nicolás Maduro and promote an alternative government of Juan Guaido. But when you see the votes in the UN, although you did say those countries do tend to support Venezuela, what tends not to be said is like the African Union or virtually every country in Asia would support Venezuela, whereas you look at the countries that support the US and Guaido, it tends not to be such a parcel of great countries. Sure, there are a few European countries sprinkled in there, but then there are also highly authoritarian governments in Latin America. And so basically, the support or rejection of Venezuela tends to come down to how closely allied you are to the United States and what your own internal government thinks of socialism. So we've seen a country like Brazil, which was one of Venezuela's closest allies until 2016, when their president Dilma was impeached, has suddenly swung way off to the other side with the election of far-right Jair Bolsonaro and is now one of Venezuela's biggest enemies. And so, yes, this is totally political. It just is basically a reflection on the state of the world and the coalitions that exist and who has the power in the world right now.
Could you please talk about the recent cases of interference, destabilization campaigns against the government of Venezuela? What is the direction this is going in your view?
Well, since January 2019, when Juan Guaido declared himself president, I think the political situation is, well, at any point you could say it's an awful situation, but really in the last 18 months, it really has been like that with Guaido launching coup after coup attempts. He's launched 5 by my count, all of them supported by the US government, but none of them particularly successful, and some of them very poorly planned indeed. That was culminated by a May coup attempt where he enlisted the support of an American mercenary group, Silvercorp. The operation was that Silvercorp would land on a beach in Venezuela and shoot their way to the Miraflores presidential palace and then ensconce Guaido in there, at which point this American mercenary group would become basically Guaido's own death squad, putting down any sort of resistance to his rule. That hasn't worked, and the government is still pretty much completely in charge in that sense. But the problem is that the country doesn't really have a loyal opposition. The opposition for years and years, one could say almost 20 years, has been solely dedicated to overthrowing the government. And because it's got the backing of the world's only superpower, it does have the resources to continue to do this, which means Venezuela is in a politically extremely volatile place. Economically, it has been crippled by sanctions, by government ineptitude, and just by the general economic downturn. So all of these factors have created this perfect storm where there is basically this sort of social and political disaster going on. In December, there are going to be elections to the National Assembly, but frankly, I don't think that's going to completely change anything, even if the government wins, and that would mean it would then control all branches of government again. It's not like the opposition needs that base of power, because its power comes from its own economic might and from support from outside. And so this situation is going to continue. I don't know where it's going to go. I hope it wouldn't go in the way that Nicaragua went, which in the 1980s, where the US basically strangled it into submission to the point where the Nicaraguan people were willing to accept Violeta Chamorro as their president. But, even looking a couple of months into the future with Venezuela is pretty difficult. So I'm not going to give you any concrete predictions for the next couple of years.
It is not going to de-escalate. There is no reason for the United States and for its allies in the region to stop.
Yes, I don't really think so. I mean, it's possible that a new government in the United States under the Democratic Party might take a different line, but the Democratic National Platform makes it clear that they are totally committed to ousting Maduro. Juan Guaido, who is supported in recent polls that showed that a maximum of 3% of Venezuelans back his bid to be president. He was supported completely in a completely bipartisan fashion at the State of the Union address, where he was given a hero's welcome and a standing ovation by both Democrats and Republicans. And so I think that whoever is in charge in the US come November, there's going to be more similarities than differences. And so, frankly, I don't see a quick resolution to this happening in Venezuela, unless, of course, some member of the opposition, Guaido, manages to seize power. But even that's not going to be the end of it, because there's going to be huge resistance to that, especially if it becomes undemocratically.